or sometimes humanities are present, but just like a little appendix to the social sciences. And I think in most cases, this is mainly due to biases in the source data. So the quote there about Web of Science indexing only 4% of humanities journals from Norway, Finland, and Spain illustrates the point, I think. However, there are so-called full coverage databases that aim to comprehensively cover research output from certain countries or regions. So we did, in the context of ENRESH, a report and a study on that. I'll not go into this further, but the important point is that VABB is one of these databases that has this goal. Specifically, it aims to comprehensively cover peer-reviewed publications from social sciences and humanities in Flanders. That's the important geographic restriction. It's something that's used in the Flemish performance-based research funding system. Mm-hmm. So publications get submitted to VABB. That happens by universities, but there are certain criteria. So not everything can get included. So in the end, publications that are included, they either are also indexed in Web of Science, because that's also an important parameter in the funding system, or if not indexed in Web of Science, they are selected by a panel of senior scholars, the so-called authoritative panel. So we distinguish only 5 publication types, but they're pretty broad, and well, the figure gives an idea of the distribution. So journal articles are indeed the vast majority, but also chapters, books as authors, and monographs, proceedings, and edit books. And so as I mentioned, we can distinguish 3 subsets. Everything that gets submitted but not included in the end. And as you can see, it's actually almost half of publications. And the ones that do get included, it's roughly 50-50 between Web of Science and what gets selected by the panel. As for the topic modeling that I'll come to in a minute, we apply this to all 3 subsets because we wanted to get some kind of holistic overview of everything that is done by SSH scholars, so not just the peer-reviewed stuff, but also the things that are not necessarily peer-reviewed. So the idea here is, of course, that this kind of database can also foster bibliodiversity. So can take account of research in different languages, other publication types, more local outlets, and so on. But when we think about diversity, we very often think that it's something that runs along disciplinary lines. And I think one of an important insight that several studies have shown is that in social sciences and humanities, it's actually more complex than that. There's also a lot of intra-disciplinary diversity. So I'll not go into this particular study in too much detail, but the important insight that they found is that actually, if you look at, for instance, a discipline like philosophy, we find that some philosophers, they operate very much in a typical humanities fashion. They work alone, they publish books, this kind of thing. But there are also others who publish a lot in English in international journals and so on. So more like what we think of like a STEM approach of working. And it's this kind of tension that made me realize that perhaps a topic level analysis might help to better understand this. So brings me to what I was aiming for. In a nutshell, a comprehensive map of topics in VABB. So something that is completely based on local data sources, meaning our own data. using just the limited metadata that we have available, which importantly means no citations. We have a multilingual database, so English is the largest language, but there's a sizable proportion of Dutch, and then many other languages, French, German, and so on, 52 different languages in total, and multiple publication types. And our first approach, which we used in this paper from 2022, used something called top2vec. It's, let's say, a combination of different existing methods that can be used to determine topics from a set of texts. Leading us to figures like this map on the left here, where, well, every point is one publication. We also did some clustering, but since there are hundreds of clusters, it's hard to distinguish them visually. So just the 10 largest clusters here are colored and labeled, as you can see. So this was, I think, a very important step because it showed that it is possible to do this kind of thing also on a multilingual data set. But we also had some limitations here, I think. And the most important ones are related to top2vec in itself. Firstly, it's a pretty rigid system. So it's a combination of methods, but it doesn't really allow for a lot of flexibility there, especially in terms of choosing embedding models. So that's the first thing. It's also not very actively maintained. I checked yesterday, and the last update happened, I think, more than a year ago. And then there are a few limitations more related to how we used it. So this brings me to more recent approach that we worked on, which uses something called BERTopic. It's quite similar in a way to what top2vec did, but the important advantage, I think, is that it has a very modular design. And the website has these nice illustrations that really convey this message. So it's like you have a bunch of Lego blocks and you can put them together in whatever way you want. So as you can see, it's basically consists of different layers, each being responsible for a different aspect of the whole thing. And within each layer, you have a bunch of choices. So I'll walk you through what our approach is, and then show you some results. So I break it down into 5 steps. It's actually more, but this is a slight simplification. So we start with the titles and abstracts of all publications. So this can be in different languages. We don't have abstracts for everything, by the way. So in some cases, it's just like a title of a chapter plus the title of a book, this kind of thing. But in some cases, the information is limited. And step number 2 is, I think, the most important one, because having raw text as such is hard to work with computationally. But nowadays, we have these transformers models that can help us encode this textual information into a vector, like a list of numbers, 384 numbers in our case. And you can think of these vectors as being coordinates in a multidimensional space. And the important thing is that the aim of these models is that texts that are similar in some way, that are about similar topics, will end up with coordinates that are also located close to each other. It's also in step 2 that we address the whole language issue. because of course different languages use different words, because nowadays there are platforms where there's like a whole bunch of different possible models available, including several multilingual models that have been trained on multiple languages and that also understand the equivalence between different languages. So we use this model with complicated name paraphrase, multilingual mini LML12v2. So it's not very not very sexy name, but it's a model that understands quite a few languages. I don't remember exactly how many, but most of the languages in our data. So we have then for every publication is represented by a vector. We reduce these vectors, their length to just 5, and then we can cluster them. So we find publications that are located close to each other. Remember, that means they're talking about similar things. And we cluster them, and each cluster we interpret as being a topic. At that point, we still have like a big table with numbers, so that not something you can easily interpret, but we did already some kind of dimensionality reduction. We can do it again, but reduce it to just 2 dimensions. And so in step 4, if you have 2 dimensions, you can show it visually. So we have positions, and then finally we add labels to them. I'll come back to that in a second. I'll skip over this in the interest of time. So for labeling topics, step 5, I took inspiration, or I shamelessly stole, if you will. I took inspiration from this blog post by the CWTS team about how they classify research publications. They use a citation-based approach, but then for labeling their clusters, they do that using, well, you know, ChatGPT. And I used an approach that's almost identical to theirs, except for some very limited details. So essentially what we do is we give a list of about 100 publications to ChatGPT from one topic. And we say, okay, now you please tell us in a short label, what do you think this is about? And it turns out it's actually very good at this kind of summarization task. So giving us, in the end, a visual representation. So in this figure, every circle you see is one topic. The larger the circle, the more publications in the topic. So some of them are labeled here. In fact, they all have a label, but not every label is shown because it would make the whole thing unreadable. I see that I somehow forgot to explain the different colors here, but red means it's a topic that's dominated by humanities. Blue means it's a topic dominated by social sciences. Green is dominated by law, and yellow are other disciplines, because it's a bit complicated to explain, but because of the way the database is set up, we also have some publications that are not really in social sciences, or not exclusively. And now the interesting thing, or at least the interesting thing to me, is that we can now also analyze these topics by all kinds of other variables, including ones relating to bibliodiversity. So for instance, if we check per topic, what's the share of book publications here, we can see that there's a huge variation. So the color coding here works in such a way that the dark blue means 0 or very, very little. and then going from green all the way to yellow, yellow being the highest. And the highest in this case is a bit over 0.6 apparently. And green being somewhat in between. So as you can see, and it's not really surprising, I guess, is that we see this is more in the humanities. This is a bit higher, and it's very low to almost non-existent, especially in the other disciplines. If we look at the share of English, you get a very different picture, of course, with especially on the side where we have most of the other disciplines being very high shares and very low shares in the humanities, but even more so in law at the bottom there. To illustrate how this can give us some insight that goes further than just having a disciplinary classification, I want to briefly walk with you through two examples. And the first one is where we look at three topics that are dominated by philosophy as a discipline. So I indicated them here. And for each of these philosophy topics, so they are metaphysical thought, works of Kierkegaard and Hillesum, and adaptive logic. For each of these topics, I mentioned three very basic variables that are, I think, related to bibliodiversity. And as you can see immediately, they are actually very different, with the Kierkegaard and Hillesum topic being most closely to what we usually think of as being a humanities way of publishing, with almost no visibility in Web of Science. 3/4 of publications are books or chapters, and well, the share of English is 50%, so not that low, but certainly not very high either. On the other end, the adaptive logic topic is almost completely dominated by English, is a far larger share, smaller share of book publications, much more visible in Web of Science. And the metaphysical thought, the third one, is a bit in between those two extremes. These are not the only topics from philosophy, by the way, but I didn't want to list like 10 or more topics here. It's just as an illustration. If we go through this on a discipline-to-discipline basis, you will find this kind of pattern where different topics really also exhibit different traits over and over again. Also, perhaps in fields where you think, well, they are very much oriented to one side, such as economics and business, which is usually, I think, discipline where we think, okay, they really are focused on the international journal articles, English language publications, and so on. And that's really the pattern we see in the topic of project scheduling, for instance, with 98% English, almost no book publications, 70% in Web of Science. But even there, we have some, less, but still we have some topics, such as financial accountability, that are quite different. So that one, financial accountability, it's still consisting of 560 publications. There's only half of publications are in English. We have a sizable portion of book publications, and it's only to a very limited extent visible in Web of Science. Okay, I think I have to move to conclusions. So I want to present you a few challenges, and then I stop. So on the whole, I think it works quite well, but we still find that some topics are broad or vague, or there's overlap with others. For instance, there are topics legal theory, legal scholarship, and legal science. What's the difference between them? I'm not really sure. It's very hard to say. And really looking at those topics, so it's not just the labels, doesn't really help. It's fairly computationally intensive to do this, especially calculating the embeddings. At least it's intensive enough that I cannot do it on my own computer realistically, so I use Google Colab for that. A very practical thing is that there are some small, in the context of our database, languages that are currently not understood by the model. There are other models that we could experiment with. So one thing that I thought might be a solution is that several of these large language models also make embeddings available through an API, so you don't have to calculate them yourself. So I tried doing this with OpenAI, so the makers of ChatGPT have, but the result I got from that looks like this. So you immediately see a very strange structure with two clusters, and the color coding here refers to language. So there's some kind of language gap where all topics with less than 25% of English, and those are mostly Dutch, are clustered together. So clearly, this does not really reflect only the extent to which the topics are similar. It also reflects somehow just the language in which these publications are, which is not what we aimed for. There's an interesting blog post that explains the problem, and that also promises if you use R embeddings, you won't have this problem, but I haven't tried that yet, so I cannot say if it really works. So to say that OpenAI embeddings probably not really a solution, maybe others help. I'm gonna stop here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Raf, for this interesting and very clear presentation. Of course, comments and questions are welcome. There are already some in the chat. I suggest that those who have a question or a comment, you can write it in the chat so you don't forget it, and we will pick it up after the next speakers. So next one out is Professor Andrea Bonaccorsi from the Economics and Management School of Engineering of the University of Pisa. So Andrea's main interests are...
Yes,
Hello.
I'm here.
Yes, there you are. Yeah, I'm just introducing you. So your main research interests, they are in the economics of science and innovation, with more than 200 works published and highly ranked. So we're very happy that you have taken time to come here and tell us about a very different part of the research ecosystem, which is research users. And if you look at the knowledge about research use, you often discover that we know much less about the users of research than we know about researchers' user orientation. So this is very valuable work. So over to you, Andrea.
Okay, thank you. Do you see my screen?
I can see your screen. Maybe you can enlarge it, put it in presentation mode.
Yes, let's try to go full screen. Okay. So thank you for inviting. My presentation will be actually based on results that have been done before the ChatGPT revolution. So one message is that we can do much better than we did with the current tools. We pioneered the idea that in order to study the impact of research, it would be a useful approach to try to define the notion of users taken from the large literature on the impact of research, in which we deal with direct users, those that have a take-up, direct take-up of the result of research, as well as indirect users, those that have a beneficial impact from research that is declared, discussed in the report of researchers themselves. The background of the team was basically technical one. I'm an economist that has been teaching in the School of Engineering the last 20 years, and we created a team, an interdisciplinary team that has been working on natural language processing in the last more than 10 years. That is much before it became popular, and of course with tools that are now probably outdated. For example, named entity recognition or semantic hypergraph. More complicated tools. Now you can do much better with probably 1% of the effort, but the idea I think is still interesting. The idea is as follows: that and this is the collection of paper already published. So my co-authors are Nicola Meluso, now in Leuven, Filippo Chiarello, currently in my university, Gualtiero Fantoni as well.
Andrea, excuse me. We are still on the first page, and it's not showing in presentation mode yet. So maybe you can see if you can kick it off.
Why is that happening?
A good question.
So, do you see now the table?
I see the table. It's
okay.
It's
so
still not in
way.
presentation mode, but it's legible. So we can go on.
Okay, I go this way. It's too complicated to go back.
That's fine. Please go on.
Yes. Then there will be big pictures, so it's not important to have full screen. Our idea was that if we look at research evaluation in a traditional sense, the notion of user is very well defined, because basically the users are other researchers. They give you the input in terms of the use they do with your research, for example, by citing you or by using your results in their research. While on the contrary, if we look at the societal impact, the groups of users are very heterogeneous, ill-defined. The time scale is very often unknown or ambiguous, and the interaction is typically interactive. So while in research evaluation you have an impact to your colleagues, here you interact with your user groups, with your stakeholders, or whatever you define, in a very complex way. And typically you involve them in the process, so that at the end, what is typically an epistemological issue in evaluation, that is that we attribute the impact to the author, is more complicated. The impact may come from a long, uncertain, complicated social process of interaction. So the idea was that if we look at the users in the traditional research evaluation setting, as Glanzel and Schubert has sometimes declared, the size of the set is a priori fixed, because the publications, when they are published, they never disappear, and then you have each year a flow of articles, which is not at all the same in social impact, in which we thought that the lexicon approach could be more useful. And we said that, let's say, several years ago. So the flow was more supervised, kind of obsolete technology today, in which we can do unsupervised in most cases. And we developed a lexicon. So it's called also Gazette kind of approach, in which we define, by combining a large number of sources, the notion of social users. That is, social groups that are mentioned in existing literature of any kind. For example, labor statistics, employment statistics, professional categories, diseases, hobbies, sports, whatever. And we ended up with more than 70,000 items that we then launched on the collection of the REF, of the English Research Excellence Framework, not the current one, but the previous one, which was published. And you, of course, know that they published the entire case studies of the researchers. And we obtained in this way 27 cluster. And interestingly, the main words associated with this lexicon was pretty nice. We did a lot of check about these words, and they were typically very well semantically correlated. So in a sense, the reliability of the approach was fairly strong. Of course, now ChatGPT might do better, but we didn't try to replicate with ChatGPT. So what we did, we launched this taxonomy on the entire ref collection, and then we did the same for individual universities. So to give you an example, this is the entire UK research in terms of the user groups. User groups defined at the course level, okay, it's course grain level, so not granular, okay. For example, what is immediately interesting is that the impact of research is not concentrated in what we call the valorization of research, which is the economic section of the impact, which is companies, patents, spin-off companies, licenses, and so on, which you read on the left, bottom left, which is only I wouldn't say a tiny part, but a small part of the total, where the impact is very often on social groups, sometimes kind of social groups with serious social problems, as well as education, as well as support to the public good. Public good in terms of political services, expertise, local community building, adult education, and so on. So immediately we get a much more articulated picture of what is the impact of research. If we go more granular, we can do better. This is the modularity one for those of you that have the old obsolete technology. Now it's a more granular, so you can look into very many kind of social groups. Then you can ask about a UI university, okay? And that's, sorry, this is modularity 2, so more granular kind of clustering. We might want to know what happens in a given university, for example. And we did the same with the same collection of impact for Cambridge or UCL, and we could do for any UK university. So, for example, UCL has a strong orientation towards user groups in the health sectors, a lot of business, a lot of cultural heritage and museum as the most prominent kind of users. Cambridge, sorry, this is Sheffield, that's another one. Interestingly, Sheffield is more oriented towards local audiences, local community and people, local school, person, and so on and so forth. So immediately you get a picture of the kind of orientation towards user groups. And we believe that could be replicated, which we didn't do at all, but we are interested in further collaboration, in the sense that we could do really maps for individual universities. We could discuss them. Why do we only discuss research evaluation in terms of publications, and why don't we try to get a picture of the main strategic directions of your impact, okay? Of course, there will be problems of normalization because they are self-reported reports, so they are self-selected at the level of the university, but the coverage of the ref case studies was pretty large, as you know from the large literature that has been discussing that collection. One point we wanted to discuss, maybe if I have another 5 minutes, Jon? Okay, I show you.
Fine, yes.
How many? 5.
Please, yeah, please go on. 5 minutes is fine.
Okay.
You even have 10 if you like.
Yes. because what we did was a parallel developments that goes into the issue of identify the narrative of the ref case studies. And to do this, we used an obsolete technology called the semantic hypergraph, which is able to identify the causal structure of a sentence. So we launched, and that again obsolete because now with the transformer architecture that's can be done differently. And there is, as you know, a huge literature on testing for causality in ChatGPT, in the other Gen AI techniques. So it's a kind of archaeology, if you want. But what is interesting is that what we discovered is that in SSH, in social science and the humanities, the researchers build up narratives that mimic the STEM narrative. In a sense, if you want to show an impact is something that has a causal power, in the sense that you make an attribution statement in which you claim your team, your university, your department has been powerful enough to generate an impact. So the impact is clearly a causal kind of statement. And the narrative in which you build up argument to show that something is causal is a fascinating topic in philosophy, if you want. But we were able to identify linguistically. And what we found is twofold. First, people in SSH mimic, try to do the same job as their colleagues, giving you certainty about the effect, like you discover a molecule or a new drug or whatever, and you try to mimic the same technique. At the same time, that's not possible because, and that's the final comment, the causal chains in SSH are always much longer. To establish that you have generated an impact, you need a longer narrative. You live in a larger number of sentences, a larger number of items in the sentence, which means that, however, your narrative is more fragile, because the longer is the explanation, the more likely is that in the causal chain there is something that is not really causal, because it's an external factor that doesn't actually is part of your own causality statement, your own effect. Okay, so in a sense, again, by using natural language processing techniques, on one end, we were able to identify very neatly, very clearly, the social structure of user groups. At the same time, in SSH, we are problematic because we say, okay, we tend to imitate our colleague in STEM. In doing this, we follow the same kind of logical structure of causality, but we fail. Or we are more vulnerable to counterexample in which our claim for causality can be put under discussion. And that's a kind of problematic impact of our research. So I stop here, and then let's discuss with the audience later on.
Thank you very much, Andrea. This was a very rich and also thought-provoking presentation, and I really enjoyed the comparative perspectives and what you can say about behaviors in SSH, just analyzing the language. So before we open up the floor completely, we will go on to our respondent today, Denis Newman-Griffis, who is then my colleague in RORI, where we work together in a project on the use of AI in research assessment. But on the day-to-day basis, Denis is a lecturer in data science at the University of Sheffield, notably, and a research fellow of the Research on Research Institute, as I said, and also a British Academy Innovation Fellow. Their research investigates the principles and practices of responsible AI, focusing on health and disability, as well as public sector governance. So with this, Denis, I am very curious to hear what you can take from today's two quite different presentations.
Well, thank you very much, Jon, and thank you, Raf and Andrea, for your really, really interesting presentations. I've been fiercely taking notes while you've been talking. I think the things that I'm really seeing from these, both of these are really interesting, sets of pieces of work taking very different kinds of approaches. So seeing what we can learn using NLP methods to, understand SSH literature a little bit better. I think what I'm seeing is that there's a really effective use. I think, Raf, in your presentation particularly, seeing very effective use of the strengths of large language models and being able to work around or maybe avoid some of the limitations that they have. In that, what large language models are good for is describing large patterns, patterns in large scale data, being able to detect subtle differences that are beyond what we can see in a kind of document by document analysis. But what they bring with them is these very fuzzy boundaries where trying to define whether something falls on one side of a line or not, it starts to fall apart. And so this kind of clustering-based analysis, thinking spatially about the relations between different types of literature and pieces of literature, fits very well with large language models and really helps to raise the kind of tensions between different possibilities and different organizations of different categories in a way that is maybe more difficult with more traditional analysis. I think there was a very good illustration of a pipelined analytic approach. I think in both of these cases, they're very good, showing that when you're using NLP for this kind of analysis, it's not just one tool, it's not just one step that you do, it's a series of different steps of understanding. You need to transform the data and in this particular way, identify this portion of the language. What can you learn for that? What is the right tool for that? So I think these are both very good illustrations of choosing the right tool for the right problem. And the fact that you need to use multiple tools to do this kind of analysis. I think with thinking, Andrea, particularly about your presentation and seeing some of the work that you've done, it's really interesting seeing the similarities with what the analysis that you were doing and the analysis that Raf was doing, and seeing these as two different methods to approach the same kinds of goals. And so I think that's raised for me a few questions, which I'll pop out there, take my privilege as respondent, and then leave open for others to chip in on as well. I think one of the questions is always, when you're looking at new methods, particularly costly and demanding methods, such as using large language models, how you make the case for, is the benefit worth the cost? And I think, one of the things that this is raising for me is exploring, learning from this work to explore what can we do with, for example, simpler models. What could we do with things like model distillation to take the large language models for clustering and distill them down? And what can we do with thinking about the strengths of these newer methods that we can combine with the more symbolic strengths and perhaps the more rigorous, that's fair to say, the more rigorous strengths of other methods. So Andrea, your work with the semantic hypergraphs, for example, that kind of chain of causality, chain of argumentation will never be able to come out of a large language model in that same way. So I think it opens up these questions about not what method will replace what we did before, but how do we leverage the strengths of these different approaches to gain a deeper insight into what we're looking at. And the other question I'll stick out with that before allowing you to respond is, when we think about this in terms of evaluation, both of these, I think, have been very useful studies for looking at how we can gain better insight into the work that's done, the argumentations that are presented, and so on. If we wanted to take forward some of these methods for use in evaluation, for use in, say, automating portions of evaluation, which I know is a popular topic at the moment, if not necessarily one that people are taking up, it raises then the questions of external validity, of how we can understand that these patterns that are identified are truly genuine, are reliable enough to take forward in a case where there's substantive economic or research-based impact that comes out of the work. So those are questions that are coming to my mind in thinking about how to move forward with these. Those are both of these very interesting talks, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Denis. Maybe before we go back to the chat where there are two questions and open up the floor, maybe a quick comment from Raf and Andrea on especially the last question from Denis. Would you be comfortable with these methods being used in research evaluation for classifying or some kind of pre-evaluation phase? Raf first, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Denis, for your very kind and generous comments. I was a little bit nervous when I saw that a lecturer in data science would be responding, because I'm not really a data scientist, to be honest. I'm a bibliometrician who kind of is exploring these methods as we go. But I'm very happy that you feel this way in general about them. And yeah, I agree that external validity is a key issue, and I don't think that I have completely solved it. So at the moment, my way of using this is really as a tool to try and gain some further understanding that goes beyond the traditional disciplinary classifications that we mostly use. There's a question in the chat about it, so we can come back to that later. Would I feel comfortable that this is just used in an evaluation context? To be honest, no. I think I'm not quite sure how to solve it. But I think certainly some additional work would be needed before I would recommend doing that. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Andrea, do you have any thoughts on this move?
Yes, and again, thank you for the comments. We didn't run any validation study, and I recognize that our user groups are kind of information that are included in the self-reports of the UK research departments, right? As a submission to the ref. As far as I know, there has been some effort to use other sources, like for example altmetrics, to derive similar narratives, for which, however, the issue of standardization is much more severe, of course. What I'm confident about is, on the contrary, on the taxonomy of the social groups, because we tested this taxonomy with Lexicon in different contexts. For example, in patents, in identifying the user of inventions in technology. Okay, and we believe that's a very useful tool. In a sense, it's saturated. It's a kind of methodology which is typical of this supervised machine learning, in which you build up a lexicon and you stop when you saturate the semantic space. But saturation is something we are familiar with in social sciences, because it's one of the classical methodology for triangulation, field research, qualitative research. So from the methodology, I would be okay. From the source, of course, I have no claim of validity. On your more general question about evaluation, we are doing some research using several Gen AI to check to what extent the kind of inductive and abductive kind of reasoning is found in Gen AI. Okay, one line of experimentation is whether the reasoning about the strategy is correct or not. Preliminary results are quite skeptical, and the ability Gen AI to produce long and deep kind of reasoning, which is the one you do if you do human-like evaluation, which you give a judgment by combining in a logical way several feature, several judgment criteria. So on the use of this tool for evaluation, I would be very, very cautious and a bit skeptical.
Thank you very much. That study, I think we should get back to at some point. So, but it's quite, it's also quite intuitive that the probability of a specific word order is not the same as logical thinking, but not necessarily.